Okay, we're live. Good afternoon, basic people. Welcome to the People's Basics, where we come once again to celebrate our movement for the universal basics of income, services, and rights. Today on the program, we're doing another Commoner's Corner segment. Today, we're going to be talking with Awkward, who is an advocate of police and prison abolition. We want to put it out in front. We want to bring in a variety of opinions across the spectrum to truly understand what they believe and how their ideas can potentially work. I will admit, I am coming in with an open mind. I'm not on the complete side, but I want to learn more from our guest today about what the solutions are to prison abolition and police abolition. So without any further ado, let's bring onto the show Awkward to introduce himself to you all. Awkward, welcome to the People's Basics.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
You're very welcome. So, I want to, before we get into our conversation today about the issues, I want people to know a little bit more about yourself. Could you let our folks out there know a little bit more about what you do, where you're from, and how you politically identify?
Sure. I'm from New York. I'm a hip hop artist, activist, journalist, and strategist. Been doing this for about 25 years now. And my focuses have always been around the rights of working class and poor people, inequality and injustice, and racial discrimination. I am a police and prison abolitionist, which means that I believe that we can develop alternative mechanisms for keeping us truly safe and healthy and supporting each other within our communities to the point where police and prisons and punitive punishment are no longer necessary. As far as my political ideology, I'm as far left as they go. I really believe, although I don't label myself anything, I really believe that, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have big government, that we would have communities, taking care of themselves. But the alternative to that would be almost the biggest form of government, where we provide things like universal basic income, where instead of funding, war and police, we funded education and healthcare. So what we have now is basically the last option. It's what we don't want, which is big government that puts its money in the wrong places.
That makes sense to me in the sense of, hey, if we're going to have government, it should be good government. Either have very, very small, bad government or large, good government. I think that's a reasonable kind of framing. So let me ask you, in framing this kind of good government, you obviously mentioned a couple policies, but holistically, what do you think the responsibility of government is to its people? What is its fundamental purpose that you think it needs to achieve?
I as an abolitionist, I believe not that all people are inherently good or bad. I believe that people are human. We're animals, but we're humans, and we're fallible, but we're also reformable and transformable. And I believe that government at any level should be designed to help us, interact with each other in safe and positive ways, and provide the support mechanisms for those who, for one reason or another, don't have the capabilities to provide for themselves. Since this country was founded on the genocide of Native peoples and was built on the backs of African slaves, there's a lot that, big segments of our population are working against historically. And therefore, there are a lot of things that need to be done to make our society more equitable. If we started with a government for all people, by all people, it would be easier to just focus on disabilities and things that we're born with that restrict us from being as productive, so to speak, as other people. But I think we live in a capitalist society where productive just means working as many hours for people who own the big businesses, and not about living a happy, healthy life. And so in my ideal vision, our society would work to make it equitable for all peoples, taking into account the result of history as well as current day conditions, so that we can all not necessarily work as many hours as possible and make as much money as possible, but all know that we're going to be housed in a safe place where we want to be living. Go to bed having eaten and not starving, have the healthcare we need if we get sick, and preventative services so that we don't get sick in the first place.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that notion of establishing the basics and also taking into account the historical injustices, that even if you are someone out there who believes that today we have an equal society, you, like, by the institutions and laws, you could still recognize the damage that past societies had that we've been constantly trying to reform to be more equitable, and how we, made promises in the past, especially when you reference things like slavery, to give 40 acres and a mule that we never truly honored. And it carries on through the Jim Crow era, et cetera, to the present, where we still, if you look at the statistics, and it's more of a consequentialist view, the statistics bear out that we still have not reached close to an equal society, let alone an equitable society. Right. And I think, obviously, this notion of equity and restorative justice has been part of the abolition movement, which is where I kind of want to focus now for the rest of the conversation. Could you, before we kind of start playing with the terms, could you define what prison and police abolition means to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that abolition is an alternative framework for keeping us safe. Historically, prisons have, the building of new prisons has increased, and the funding and militarization of police departments have increased at astronomical rates, in complete contrast to actual crime statistics. We have tough on crime politicians supported by scare tactics in mainstream media that have enabled laws to be passed, such as the Joe Biden's crime bill, that criminalize certain communities and create profit for certain corporations through mass incarceration. Our current system takes these criminalized segments of our society and gets rid of them, puts them in places that we don't have to deal with them, that makes us feel safer, when in reality, most crimes are committed by people we know. And murder and rape and serial killers and child molesters and all of the things that people harp on are the least common examples, like instances of crime that we actually experience in this country. Yeah. The vast majority of people who are arrested and incarcerated, who are in prisons, are there for nonviolent offenses, often for drug offenses, where had they not been criminalized and targeted by police in the first place, they'd be safely doing it at home. And then you take statistics like 75% of those in jail have never even been convicted of a crime. In an abolitionist society, instead of having police patrols of criminalized neighborhoods, finding opportunities to arrest, try and incarcerate people, we develop, as I said, alternative mechanisms that would actually keep us safer. So this would include jobs training and education. It would include healthcare for all. It would include substance abuse and mental health treatment. And it would include, safety safety checks instead of police patrols, and it includes rehabilitation, it includes mediation, and a different form of justice where people are repaired and transformed in the process. So both the victims and the perpetrators, who, by the way, have historically most often been victims themselves, come together and actually are, both transformed through the process. And those who've committed crimes are actually held responsible for their actions. They owe a human duty to fix what they did, to repair the break in society that they've caused. And that isn't achieved in prison. In prison, they're not rehabilitated. You see through recidivism rates that the system is designed just for them to go back. And the people who've been harmed, we've been led since birth to believe that punishment is the answer, that prison is the only solution. And we think that's justice, but it doesn't actually make us safer. It doesn't fix the community. It doesn't fix the family that was harmed. It doesn't bring the person back who was killed, or, whatever it may be. And it doesn't address any of the underlying causes of crime in the first place.
So there's a lot to unpack there. There's definitely parts that I 100% agree with, that we overcriminalize too many things, and that the vast majority of what we think police should be handling in response to violent crimes is a significantly small portion of what is handled. It's roughly 4% of the responsibility of what police officers handle today. Completely agree with you there. I would caveat, I do think some of the crime bills that were passed in the 90s were a response to an increase in crime that occurred during the 80s, which is partially responsible by the Reagan administration when they just completely shuttered so many mental health facilities and closed down vast majorities of asylums and released people into the streets, coupled with a rise in drug use within that period of time. I think those things, as you said, deserve their own forms of treatment, mental health facilities and rehabilitation. But when it comes to actual officer presence, a lot of people do feel like it brings them some form of safety. In a Reuters poll recently, they said that 77% of people feel safer when they have police presence within their area actively patrolling. And we have studies that also show methods like hotspot policing and deterrence policing show decreases in violent crime. And so I'm curious, what makes you feel like policing doesn't keep people safe when 77% of people are feeling that way? Why aren't police keeping us safe?
Well, for one, I'm curious who they polled, because they're not keeping us safe. And a lot of people understand that because they live it. Eric Garner was filmed being choked to death in New York City. He was the first person to gain, through his murder, international notoriety for saying "I can't breathe." The only reason we are aware of that, to the extent that we are, is that Ramsey Orta was so used to being stopped and frisked and bullied and beaten up by police that he literally, as soon as he walked out the door, turned his phone camera on to start taping if a police officer came anywhere near them. So he was able to record that incident. There's still the misconception that police in general keep all of us safer. But again, this is propaganda. This is brainwashing. This is what we've been told since birth. And we've never seen any alternatives. So that's what abolitionists are trying to do, is propose these alternatives and city by city implement them so that we can have the research to back up our claims further than just the stuff I'm about to point out, the truth about police. But of course, police today keep some people safer. They protect white people from black and brown people. They protect rich people from poor people, and they protect private property from protesters. The whole concept of broken windows policing has been shown to be total BS. The idea was that if something doesn't look pretty, it's going to lead to more crime. And the examples of types of policing that you're talking about, where like hotspots and things like that, that is essentially racial profiling. That is class profiling. Those are the epitome of the types of policing that are designed to target already criminalized populations, and they're criminalized because of their race and their class. Sure, more people who are in desperate need to pay their bills when they have no support from the government, or who are not able to get drug treatment or mental health treatment and have an addiction or something else, they're obviously more likely to commit crimes. They're not rich enough to pay for it themselves, and the government doesn't help them. That's why we have to address the underlying issues. But here are the facts on the police. They kill 3 people every day. They're responsible for 1/3 of all stranger murders in this country. And they solve 2% of all major crimes. So before you even start thinking about what alternatives we can propose, let's just face the facts. What we're doing right now is not working. It doesn't work in general. It doesn't work in general in the sense that it doesn't help all people. It doesn't protect all people. However, it's working exactly as intended. Cops are the most violent people in this country, and because of qualified immunity and other laws, they can do it with impunity. But this is exactly as it was designed. Policing in this country was created during the time post-slavery, during the time of black codes, to create chain gangs to continue the profiteering off the backs of black people. They literally changed laws and created new laws to target the things that black people were doing, that to make them felonies so they could fill the prisons and get more slave labor. And it's written into the 13th Amendment of our Constitution. Slavery is illegal as long as you haven't been incarcerated. And since we know that those who are incarcerated are disproportionately Black and brown and indigenous and trans, and we know that it's predominantly poor people who can't afford to pay for the lawyer, it's actually a sentence of slavery if you have been criminalized. The number of people who've committed crimes is completely unrelated to the number of people who have been arrested and incarcerated for committing crimes. Most people have committed one crime or another. In some places in this country, all it takes is jaywalking, and you are now in the system. And once you're in, it's very difficult to get out.
Yeah, and it also certainly has impacts on you trying to rebuild your life, even if you are lucky enough to escape the system. I wholeheartedly agree with you on the recidivism problem. Let's talk for a moment. Let's say for the people who fully recognize what you're trying to say and that the current system is broken, but they, stick with the devil they know rather than the devil they don't know. They're worried about what does the replacement look like. Obviously, we can agree that some of these services that, regardless of police presence, we need to be doing to repair our communities would help in reducing crime. But I think we both can recognize that we're probably not going to reach a utopia where zero crime happens. And so I'd like to ask you, in those cases where you do have violent crime, in a world without police and prison, how do you handle those circumstances?
Yeah, sure. I mean, right now, in addition to only solving 2% of crimes that have been committed, and like there being 1 million rape kits just sitting in warehouses, never tested, cops also don't stop crimes in the process. The rare occasion that it happens is that the place they're patrolling, they happen to see something. Otherwise, they're just patrolling to look for problems, and then they come after the fact and nothing really resolves itself. And so, the idea that, overnight we should remove all cops because of this and release everyone from prisons and jails because of this is kind of a misunderstanding, at least in my version of what abolition means. And I do believe that the vast majority of abolitionists think this way as well. And that is, step one is what is already happening. We've defunded 150 billion or so just since like last April from 20 plus cities' police departments across the country. Of course, it's important to note that overall police spending actually increased since 2020. And that's in that's following the longest period of sustained protest in our nation's history. The result of that is a George Floyd Act that actually increases police funding by $750 million. There's a lot of reforms proposed that are essentially gentler versions of genocide that, don't necessarily that don't change the system, that don't fix the underlying causes. They essentially create an even stronger system by assuming and proliferating what is already existing and just altering it slightly. So it gets great news coverage. People are celebrating. But when you look at it, everyone's in the same place they were. And in this case, this law doesn't even make illegal what happened to George Floyd and gives the cops more money. So we know they can't police themselves. And this just tells them to continue to not do that. What we're saying is step one is defund the police. And you don't just take money from police departments and expect them to do the same stuff. As we're defunding down to zero, we are allocating those resources to the alternatives that I'm talking about, to new programs that, they exist in Portland, they exist in other cities, they exist in Austin, I believe, to alternative programs that are actually designed to prevent crime in the first place and respond to crime without guns, with people who are trained to deal with mental health issues and to de-escalate. Cops come and they start shooting people. We see it literally every single day. So this will take time in every city across the country and the state level and everything else. If we continue to defund and put the money where it actually belongs to build our communities, to build these alternative mechanisms, when we will eventually get to the place where police are not necessary. Of course, this can't happen overnight because our current society has relied on them for generations. So we need to build these things in their place. And the same can be said for prisons. Certainly, there are things that we can do, like ending cash bail. The 75% of people in jail who have not been convicted of a crime don't belong there. They're there because they're too poor to pay their bail. It can be as little as $10. And that may be too much for that person. Don't you think the problem really is that person's poverty? That person was arrested in jail because they stole a few essentials from a convenience store. They should have those essentials. And there are a ton of people who are still in prison for nonviolent drug offenses as we legalize marijuana across the country and we decriminalize, other drugs. These people belong out right now. And again, over time, as we build newer, safer mental health institutions that don't mimic the punitive, prison-like institutions of the past, when we build substance abuse treatment centers, and all of this is funded by the public instead of the public funding police, the people who need help can be put into those places instead. And those who don't can be out and actually have the reentry services funded that they need to be able to come back and be a happy, healthy member of our society.
Yeah, I think a lot of that does make sense to me. I think the last part I wanted to focus with you, Awkward, is kind of just reflecting on where we are today in terms of public perception of the movement and what we need to do, in your opinion, to shift that needle in favor of it. Mm-hmm. Currently, when it comes to polling, I'm going to cite an Ipsos poll. Reforming of the police is supported by 51% of people compared to 19% opposing. We have defund the police, which is supported by 18% of people and 58% of people opposing. And abolition of the police has 11% of people supporting and 67% of people not supporting. And so I'd love to ask you, in your opinion, what do you think needs to be done to get this message out there and supported by more people?
I mean, I thank you for this interview because I think it's a huge part of it. I've had the opportunity to speak with, some other people on big platforms, and there are women, Black women in particular, who've been doing this probably longer than even I have, and who are more directly impacted by it as well, who are also doing this. Education is a huge part of it. People hear me speak and break down the problems that we are experiencing now and the solutions that we can build over time, not overnight. Mm-hmm. I think more and more people come out of those conversations understanding that this is not only the right choice, but a feasible one at that. However, and I really believe that's a huge part of it. In addition to, the organization that I co-founded, 10 Demands, has 10 demands for justice. It's building the road to abolition, starting with defunding, ending with eliminating all forms of carceral punishment. And in there's a ton of laws that can and should be passed to get us to where we need to be, to end the school to prison pipeline. And these are the kinds of things that we built a mechanism to directly communicate to our leaders, because the more support we have from brave elected officials, the further we'll be able to go as well. And we made it so that you can go to 10forjustice.com, go to the Take Action page, and through text using ResistBot, send an open letter to your mayor, your governor, or your state or federal congresspeople. It's about time that some of the people that we've put into office do more than just blindly support a George Floyd Act that is only going to make things worse, and actually look at the issues and do what is best for their communities. I think in addition to those things, you need people like me. You need abolitionists, because the more that I push for abolition, even if I'm spouting nonsense, like even if I'm, not here breaking down facts and providing solutions, as the more of us there are, the more likely defunders are going to be listened to. For me, defunding is step one, defunding and reallocating. But, as long as there are people like me making them nervous, they'll be more likely to listen to people who are a little less radical. Very similar to the civil rights era, where they were terrified of Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party, so they listened to MLK and passed the Civil Rights Act. Reforming the police, which is very popular, in comparison, is not what we're looking for. Police can't be reformed. It's a white supremacist institution that's doing exactly what it was intended to do. And every single reform that is passed only strengthens the system. Adding body cameras, has that helped? Nope. They're still killing 3 people a day, turning off body cameras, using qualified immunity when they get caught. Derek Chauvin is a rare instance of someone actually being held responsible. On my Twitter account, AWKWORDRap, my pinned tweet is this thread that I put together of the absolute pandemic of police officers being guilty of murder and rape, and if they're even fired in the first place, just getting hired down the street. Reforming them isn't going to work. Better training isn't going to change this power trip that they're on and this immunity and impunity to commit violence. So reform to me is not an option. It just, like I said before, when you reform something, you're saying this is the thing. We're going to keep this thing and keep trying to change it. We want to develop another thing. Policing and prisons were created by humans not that long ago for an express purpose. And it wasn't to keep everybody safe. And it's thus just as equally possible for humans to create another thing that actually does keep us safe. So I say, platform as many people like me as possible, and continue to support mutual aid efforts and defund the police efforts in your local areas, because that's the way we're going to chip away at the system and actually get to the point where what I'm saying, it can actually happen.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting points there. I wholeheartedly agree with your notion that you need at a minimum, people like you to kind of anchor the conversation so that those that aren't necessarily full abolition, but might be more the defund people who want to at least have proper allocation of social services from the police budget get their way, because it does make them seem more reasonable in comparison. So I wholeheartedly agree at that point. And I think also, as you said, having these conversations really can help, because I personally view one of the problems with why it has such a perception is that so much of the attention goes on the problem and not enough goes on to the solution.
Yeah.
And so we can hear all day about the abuses in the police system, but people aren't aware of what is those replacement things that would be coming into it, because safety is a very emotional feeling. It's not just is your area safe? It's a perception of, do you feel safe? And sometimes it's like how we do the TSA. Is taking off your shoes making you safe? No, but it's giving you almost a feeling of safety because you're going through the show.
Yeah.
And so I think often having these conversations where we can focus on what is that replacement solution can really help us, because regardless if you're on reform, defund, abolition, we need to know what the problems are and what the solutions are at the end of the day.
Yeah,
so,
I totally agree. The solutions are important, but I do think the first step for a lot of people is acknowledging that what we have now isn't keeping us safer. It is a perception, and it's an inaccurate one, unless you're part of the segment of the population that, is least likely to be targeted. If I get pulled over, I'm still freaking out. It's one of, it's one of the reasons I don't use my real name, that and Nazis, but and often they're one and the same. But I'm still freaking out, and I look the way I look. And only a couple times have I been physically assaulted by cops. Only a couple. If I look different, I think I drive 3 miles an hour. I mean, traffic stops are what lead to murder. And so again, I always question the validity of polls, because I don't know who they're interviewing. They're certainly not interviewing people who don't have access to the internet or don't have cell phones. Those people certainly don't feel safe from cops. And there are 40 million people going to bed hungry every night in this country. I can't imagine they're being interviewed. So, I think, we do really need to acknowledge first and foremost that, if we care about the basics, if we care about protecting all of our society, that, this was never meant to do that in the first place. And these are all human creations. So, you have to be a little imaginative. You have to, break free of the prison box and the handcuffs and look beyond to something different. And as we defund and provide more and more of these social services and see that we're not only not less safe, but more safe, I think the popularity of these concepts will continue to grow.
I think that's a very fair point, especially about polling in general. I also would caveat to people, MLK Jr. Seems very popular today. He wasn't always. Look back in the day of how the sentiment was towards him. It was also very unpopular. But I do think it's important for us to acknowledge where we are so that we can track our progress over time. But Awkward, I want to thank you for coming on to the program today and sharing your perspective. Are there any final last thoughts that you want to share with the People's Basics audience?
I would just say check out 10forjustice.com and please send this letter if you support our goals to your elected officials. The music video for 10 Demands is also on there, and there's a ton of abolitionist resources. So if you want to get more background, if you want to learn from Angela Davis or Mariam Kaba, there's direct links off the site. And I'm always available if you have questions for me. I also want to say thank you. I appreciate the time and the platform, and I think this was really well done. I appreciate you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I appreciate you coming on today because, I think it's a learning process for so many of us, myself included. I said at the beginning of the show that I'm not there, but I want to learn more and I want to bring people on you so I can really understand what are we trying to go to from this movement? Because I
Yeah.
think when it comes to most media, it's very much finger pointing and judging from afar and not actually hearing. And so I really wanted to hear you. So thank you for spending the time with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So, I think that'll do it for us on this episode. I'm going to conclude now by saying, everyone, if you enjoyed our conversation today with Awkward, we're going to be including all those links that we had before. If you're watching this on YouTube, in our description section down below. Furthermore, please subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more of these videos, and also sign up yourself. We want to learn from more people in the community and hear your perspective. So click on our Linktree link and find our sign up form on our Calendly to come on and share your own perspective. But that being said, everyone, that'll do it for today's episode of The People's Basic. I hope you have a great day out there. And as always, I hope you stay classy, my basic people.